Welcome everyone to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. Each month this year, Mike and I are kind of taking a look at a classic creator, appreciating the greats that have come before and gave us the comic book industry that we have. These are the folks who are the reason that we have so many legendary characters that have inspired us for years. And today we're going to talk about one who is arguably maybe the greatest figure in all of comic books, although some of that has been debated with some folks. We're going to talk about the one, the only, the Mr. Excelsior himself, Stan Lee, the all in all kind of founder of Marvel, the master of the cameo in the MCU. We
Yes.
just wanted to talk about his overall legacy, his impact on comic books. There's a lot of controversy and things that have come up recently about Stan, or I guess the last couple decades. But Mike and I just want to talk about Stan, what Stan meant to comic books and what he means to us personally. Kind of just go through the overall impact that that man had on the comic book industry. So, Mike, for you, I know you and I are more DC guys, but we have always had a massive affinity for Stan Lee and his place in comics. When I mention the name Stan Lee, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you?
I think of Spider-Man,
Mhm.
and I think of comics, just comics in general. His name is synonymous with comic books and will forever be linked to this wonderful medium that we all love and enjoy. There's just something about his legacy that is just, he's inextricably linked to comic books, the fandom, the movies, the books, and the fans. And the adoration of Stan, is just unparalleled in our medium of choice. He is the true giant. Um, uh, and of course, you got to have Jack in there and Steve Ditko and John Buscema and John Romita, all these giants of the industry. But Stan was right there alongside him. And and I got a comment. You're wearing a Raiders jersey. What number are you wearing, sir?
28. Got Josh Jacobs. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Very good. Nice choice. I have to like that choice. But no, but seriously, I will always remember the day that Jackson and I met Stan Lee at a Comic Con about 10 years ago. And it was just a magical day for, two comic book fans to go in there and I was always, major or majorly a DC fan, but of course I loved my Marvel too. And Stan was there, involved in all the Marvel comics that I loved in the 70s, and shared in the joy of my son as he was growing up, and he loved the Marvel characters, somewhat DC, but he was mostly a Marvel guy. And I just enjoyed that time of my life. And he always had a thing for Stan. He knew that Stan wrote the stories, and he appreciated the stories. Of course, he loved the characters. And, as he grew up, he grew to know the artists, the different artists for Spider-Man and Thor and Hulk and all the characters that he loved. He came to understand the creative team and what it takes to put together a comic book. But Stan was, Jackson was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 when he met Stan.
Yeah.
And we got the photograph, we got the little thing, and it's been on his wall in his bedroom, his whole life almost.
Yeah. No, I think the thing with Stan, like you said, he's just so linked to comics. I think my wife knows like very little about comic books, and she sees Stan, oh, it's the comic book guy, right? She
Right.
like instantly knows Stan Lee, and I think that's one thing I think that's popped up with Stan is, people talk about how much was him, how much was his co-creators, how much credit does he get, how much does he not, that kind of thing. And what I'll say is, I think so much of that's up for debate. I would probably say, yeah, it's probably a little more Kirby than Stan on some of the books, but in all honesty, there's a ton of Marvel characters that work that were not Jack. Stan is the guy who was involved in all of them. Jack was not really involved too much with Spider-Man, and that became the massive Marvel character that defines their genre. So to kind of take credit away from Stan, I think is just always foolish in that while you can say maybe he took too much credit, I think he himself even admitted at times, he had a tendency to grab too much credit for things. I think Stan serves such an essential function in comic books because what he was able to do is he was able to get comic books to another level. Stan, in a lot of ways, and for lack of a better term, was the mascot of comics. He was the guy that everybody would look and go, that's the comic book guy. And something about his personality, the charm that he just always came off like your lovable uncle at Thanksgiving dinner telling a story, and you were just captivated with that guy talking. And that's why the
I,
cameos worked, and so much of that is it. He just was such a good representative for the medium. Go ahead, Mike.
I will say that you know the the history of Stan, goes back to the 40s, right? And his cousin, owned the publishing company that churned out these books. And I think we have to take a minute and recognize what was going on at that time. These books were trash. They were meant to be thrown away, and they cost a dime a piece, and they were thrown together in a very, quick, consumable, way. And they were thrown out there in bundles on the curb with the newspapers, and the newsstands unpacked them and threw them onto the racks, and they got them out the door as quick as they could. This is an industry that was, looked frowned upon, looked down upon,
Yep.
and Stan was a writer.
Hmm.
He had a great creative mind. He won contests famously for his writing, when he was in school, and so he was a writer. He knew how to tell us a good story, and he always wanted to be a novelist. So his mind was attuned to storytelling, and he was stuck in this trashy business that was throwaway, literally. Those comics went into the trash by
Yeah.
the thousands, and what didn't go into the trash got scooped up into paper drives during the World War II recyclable, collections.
Yep.
Uh, and what survived that was vilified, deified, and burned in bonfires in the 50s.
Yep.
And so, I mean, it was literally a trash market where these people who came from the Lower East Side of New York, these creative guys, figured a way to make a living out of it, and they did. And he very nearly quit the industry. But something funny happened in the mid to late 50s. And when superheroes came back, Stan was there. And I know there's a lot of debate about, the Marvel method.
Yeah.
And, Stan had a lot of plates spinning at the same time. He was fortunate enough to have Jack Kirby on one side, Steve Ditko on the other, a blossoming John Romita, Gene Colan, and all these great artists. And, they had to turn out, 5, 6, 8 books a month. And then in the mid 60s, it was even more. So they really had to do a lot of work in a short period of time. And I really believe I'm a person who was of Stan created it all. The artist just drew the story, to later on recognizing how much input Kirby and Ditko and others had into the story. And then thinking, well, maybe Stan took credit for everything and did nothing, to where I am now. And we talked about this a little bit in our Kirby video, where I believe it was more of a collaborative effort, and that Stan really had a lot of input into it, certainly more than most are giving him credit for these days.
Yeah, I think the thing is, whether he's 25% of it or 75% of it or whatever percentage you want to give him for all these Marvel characters, he is absolutely a part of it. And I think that's the thing is I think if you remove his creative brain from it, it's not
You
as
could
successful. It's
You can
just
see
not a
what
success.
happened. Talk
Yeah.
about the 1970 switch, Kirby to DC.
Yeah, Kirby's DC characters didn't hit the same way that they did when he was working with Stanley. And nothing against Kirby. I love his DC work, but it didn't hit the same way it did with Stan. Ditko's work, outside of the stuff that he was working on with Stan, did not take off. And so I think the thing is, yeah, maybe the secret sauce was mainly Ditko or mainly Kirby, but Stan was the guy who was able to take it and take it to the next level. And I think the other part that Stan has to get credit for, the ability to make a great story is one thing, to get that story out to the masses, to become this affable figure that people loved and wanted to hear talk and stand going to conventions, and how much goodwill there is in comic books from fans of people who are loyal to Stan, his Stan soapbox, and all those things that were just in Marvel Comics that created fans. That's the reason these things have been so enduring. They've lasted so long. And so I think while you can debate his place in history, you can debate how much credit he gets. There is no Marvel Comics. There is no, list of all these incredible heroes in the MCU and all these video games and cartoons without Stan. There just flat out isn't. And so it is a little tiresome when you see people continually try to like tear Stan down a little bit. And that, yeah, maybe he was a little egotistical. He probably, took a little more credit than he should have. But at the end of the day, he was absolutely essential to
You know,
everything Marvel Comics is.
you have to go back in your mind to 1965, 67, 68, when comic books were starting to have a resurgence. And all the artists and creators were working their butts off. And like you said, the creative environment that he was in, however much this person or that person did, it wouldn't have been the same without the mixture. It's like a recipe,
Yeah.
without everybody pulling their weight. But in the late 60s, when comics were trying to have a resurgence, Stan was the one who was out on the road, enlightening America to what new comic books were all about. Because you can't forget the place that comic books were in the 50s. They were evil, they were crime ridden, they were terrible, they're not for kids, we got to burn them. That's where the industry was. 10 years later, without Stan making the tracks out there and being the best pitchman, of course he was selling Marvel, but it really had an impact on the whole medium in general.
Well, yeah, ever since, Stan's, what's interesting is, we talk a lot about Marvel versus DC and stuff like that. And in all honesty, Marvel has been the big brother largely since Stan got them on their footing. Largely the popularity of Batman is kind of what keeps DC in the game from a national standpoint. But
Yes.
Marvel, by leaps and bounds, has kind of passed most of DC. And what's been interesting with that, though, is you've seen the DC characters become more like Marvel characters, and that's what helped DC get there. And that, you look at the Marvel DC characters that, were not created by Stan and stuff, a lot of them were very static as far as they stayed the same. They didn't really change a whole lot. You pick up Batman kind of from what the 40s through the 60s. It's just plain simple issues. There's not a lot of character development, a lot of huge changes. Stan with Fantastic Four and Spider-Man changed the game in terms of the story arcs, the personal journeys, the flaws that those characters had. And those all ingrained themselves into DC Comics in a much grander way after Stan did what Marvel. And so I think his place in comics, him dragging Marvel along, forced DC to up their game, and it kind of just made everything survive. And so yeah, I think it's just sad that sometimes now people have a tendency to look down on his legacy and things like that. I think it's all of these debates that we always get, and like I always bring things back to sports. You talk about like the Chicago Bulls, people go, was it Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen? It's like it's probably more Jordan, but they don't win without Pippen, right? In
Yeah.
football, was it Brady or was it Belichick? It's probably more Brady, but in all honesty, if either one of those pieces is gone, they aren't as great as they were. And I think that's the thing with Marvel is no Stan, Jack on his own was never as successful. No Stan Ditko wasn't as successful. No Stan Romita wasn't as successful. He was humongously responsible for that. And the other part is, Jack was involved with a lot of them, but like Jack didn't create all the characters. All
Yeah.
the characters that Stan was involved in, when you look at Hulk and Thor and Spider-Man and Silver Surfer, the Fantastic Four, the Black Panther. I mean, how many characters got created that they all were hits? That like all of them are still around and getting movie adaptations and have lasted. And like what's interesting is you look at the creative people around at that time, almost all the characters that are still dominant in the industry all came from that time span. You
Yeah.
look in the last 40 years of comics outside of Deadpool, Cable, Harley Quinn, a few characters here and there haven't been, especially at Marvel. Really, Marvel post Stan Lee, you've had maybe 10 characters. Wolverine's probably the biggest character that Stan wasn't involved in that's been a hit. But no one outside of Wolverine's reached the level of Hulk or Iron Man or Thor or
And
Spider Man. And that's because Stan had that secret sauce that he was able to kind of just put in there and take things to the next level.
yeah, and the Kirby fans are right when they say, Jack didn't get enough credit.
Absolutely.
Um, of course, he didn't get enough credit in his lifetime. He is and forever will be the king of comics,
King of
right?
comics. King of
I
comics.
mean, Kirby was just, a force of nature. But he did need that, creative direction here and there to take his stories to the level for whatever, and who knows how many pages that Stan, saw of Jack's and said, what would really change this story, Jack, is if did a few other panels here and I'll have the character say this and that.
Yep.
We'll never know. I do know this one phone call that there was a radio show, I think that,
Yeah, where we got on. Yeah.
yeah, where in the end they kind of both, agreed to disagree, but what they really agreed on was it was a magical moment back then,
Yeah.
and they enjoyed working together. It was a low bar business where people barely made enough money. Stan was lucky in that he got promoted and became, a publisher eventually. So he made more money than the artist did. Is that fair or not? It's probably not fair. And being part of the company, I'm sure he got some profits from some of the merchandising that was starting to happen. But Jack Kirby not getting any of that. Is that fair? No, it's not. But Stan worked his way up into an executive position, and that's just one of the things that goes with that. Um, I do know that that was magic, and kind of like the Beatles. If you took George Harrison out of the mix, or if you took John Lennon out of the
You
mix,
take any of those members away, it doesn't
yeah,
work.
it's
And
not going to
that's
work. And they never really had that magic again. And if you know that phone call from that radio show, you can tell it in both men's voice.
yeah.
They
Yeah.
wish that they would have a chance to work again, and they never did, and that's a shame.
Stan Lee, unquestionably one of the greats of comic books. I think I would say in my lifetime, there's very few figures that I have had such a love for, as far as like just purely like, oh my gosh, that guy, like Stan Lee. Like you see Stan Lee in interviews and things like that. And I know as a kid you always saw the Stan soapbox and things back in the comic books. It just really gave comic books a feel. It gave them a personality, and so many great character stories and elements he was a part of. How much of a part of is up for debate, but it is not up for debate that he was a part of it, and we would not have the industry that we have at all, or
Without
any of
it,
these great movies or characters or
no.
video games or cartoons. And I think that's the thing. Even people who are not comic book readers probably seen a Spider-Man cartoon. You probably owned a Spider-Man action figure. You probably drank a juice box that had, the thing or
Spider-Man
the
on it,
Hulk
yeah,
or something on it, right? Everybody, my 2-year-old has never read a comic book, but he's got a room full of Iron Man and Spider-Man stuff
yeah.
because of Stan Lee and because of his creations and what he did. And so Absolutely. He is one of the legends of comics, one of the most responsible figures for why we have what we have. And what I'll always say, and kind of in closing on this, I think Stan did a lot of really good things in terms of Stan's ability to address social issues of the time, things that he ingrained
Yes.
into characters like the X-Men, things that he ingrained into characters like Black Panther, and the goal that he had in telling those. While I think it's somewhat now kind of flipped to where people are a little more than he ever wanted it to be. But I think he absolutely made conscious decisions of no, I'm creating T'Challa because I want a character who looks like that to be in the pages of this comic book. And and you go back to that time and the world that he was in, that was probably not the easiest decision to get by people. But he absolutely made it because it was an important thing to him and something he believed in. Same thing for X-Men and for all the what they stood for. And I think we owe a lot of that to Stan, and that so
And
many
you
great characters and issues that he stood for really helped evolve the medium.
and a lot of the artists that were in that bullpen, all those men shared those values,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
they really did. And it's come out in subsequent interviews with others that they all shared those values.
Absolutely. No, it's a cool thing that he was able to do so much, create so many characters, be involved in so many great moments. Stan Lee, an absolute legend. Let us know what you guys think below. What is your favorite Stan Lee creation or your favorite Stan comic? Did you ever get a chance, like Mike, to meet Stan? One of my great regrets, I did not go to the last Comic Con that he was at. Figured there would be another. He didn't end up making it to another one, but an absolute legend. And I will say this: the MCU cameos, one of the coolest things that I look forward to in every film. Was
I
always so cool
know.
to see Stan in those, and just a great figure for the history of comic books. As always, folks, we appreciate you watching. We will try to have some more of these videos talking about the legends and pay due to the greats in comics who have made this industry what it is and given us so many great memories and characters. As always, we appreciate you watching, and we will catch you in our next video.
Thanks, everybody.